we do to fix it? What needs to change? All those sorts of things. But actually where anti-racism and actually living a different way together begins is in our bodies. Because that's the site of where racism began, right? It's when some people decided that some bodies weren't worth the same or didn't have the same inherent value as others. And it was for making money, it was for having power, it was all those sorts of reasons. And we all know none of us were there when that happened, but it doesn't mean we haven't absorbed the impact, right? Whether it's an impact that we might call privilege, or we might call an impact that's called, systemic oppression, or some of the impacts might just be having lost skills that our ancestors used to have, right? And one of those skills was a deep and sacred embodiment. And that's part of the Christian tradition that you hold too. It's just that it sometimes gets a little diluted over time because of its interaction with some of these other systems like racism. So if that feels like you're like, yes, I agree, or you're like, wait, what are you talking about? That's okay. We're going to get to some of that as we have a conversation together. But I wanted to just say that when we do this, being in our bodies is important. Because a lot of times some of the unhealth in the way we talk together happens because we kind of live up here instead of getting connection with what's happening. So with that, I want to invite you to just, first of all, find a comfortable position in your body. If you're comfortable exactly how you are, it's fine. Sometimes I like to line up my heels and my knees, just so I can feel the earth under my feet, right? Like I like to roll my feet sometimes even, or like wiggle my shoes. I also sometimes like to line up my hips and my shoulders. It's just whatever's comfortable, right? But for me, it sort of helps me be like, okay, just like checking in, realigning, reconnecting. And then I want you, I know we don't have room to like spread out our arms really wide, but if you want to just spread your arms a little bit, like even if it's just right in front of you, or if you want to just shrug your shoulders a little bit. We're not doing yoga, don't worry, like that's not what we're doing right now, we're just doing some stretching. And then you wanna, if you want, you can have your like hands on your legs or your knees, something like that. But all we're gonna do is we're gonna take a couple deep breaths together. And if like paying attention to your breathing, my mom hates it when anyone asks her to do that. She's like, I breathe all on my own and I don't want to be thinking about it. Don't make me think about it because it'll be like paying too much attention to how to drive a car. And then you just, you lose the thread. So if it bothers you, don't do it. But if you would like, just take a breath and see if you can feel it kind of in your abdomen or even in your back. And if you can't, maybe just see if there's a way to like start your breath lower in your body. And let your whole center of your body fill with breathing. Breathing in through your nose if that's comfortable, and out through your mouth. Again, do what's right for you. Maybe you feel your eyes closing. Or you feel yourself focusing on something right in front of you that just lets you stay focused. One more good breath together. So that was very straightforward, very simple. But it's a way that you can come back to your body, not just in this conversation, but at any moment in your day or in your life that you're feeling kind of stuck up in your head and you're thinking. Sometimes reading or watching the news can bring us into a headspace that's not helpful. And just taking a couple deep breaths, or even just feeling your fingers touching each other like this, if you were to touch each digit with your thumb. Those are really simple ways to just remember, like, hey, I'm a whole person here, right? I'm not just what I think. So thank you for doing that with me. It's a really good practice for us to humanize the conversations and the work we do together. So I do have a PowerPoint, but we don't have to stick exactly to it. If there's things we want to engage about together, I'm going to give you just a little bit of background on the report and how it came to be where it is. I'll kind of give you when I say a tour, I don't mean we're going to go through the whole report together, but I'll give you like a preview of what it looks like. And then we'll talk a little bit about where we could go from here. So, charting new routes together goes along with the theme of the report, which, for those of you who have, and how many of you have read it so far? It's okay if it's nobody, but all right, a couple folks, that's wonderful. The report itself is called Recalibrating Our Spiritual GPS, the PTCA Institutional Race and Equity Self-Assessment. So when the team was thinking about this, they were thinking about charting and navigation and things like that. And how sometimes when you're in the car and you're using whether you're using Siri or you're using Google Maps or whatever, the navigating programs, and they're like, proceed straight, and then you don't. And it's like, please go back to recommended route, right? Or something like that, where it'll kind of try to guide you along the way, but you may make your own decisions. And what does it look like to recalibrate how we understand where we are so we can figure out where we're going? Because sometimes my GPS doesn't even exactly know where I am, right? Like it gets a little lost. So, and you could think global positioning system, but they were playing with this and they thought, what if it was gospel positioning system, right? So what's our relationship to the gospel, the good news that we all care about so much together? So there will also be an audiobook format of this available soon. It's on its way, but this is the website that if you were to follow this QR code, you would get to. And this website has a little bit of information about the wider purposes of the report. As you can see here, claiming the gospel imperative for efforts around anti-racism, committing to change in our systems and in our norms, and on the move toward creative liberation and transformation. So you can see there's a lot here, including kind of a little bit more about the story of how the report came to be, a little video about it, some of the worship that we did together, the planning, the visioning, and so on. So if you want to see the report itself, the whole report, when you first open it, it can be a little stunning because it's like one of 70 pages, okay? It's not actually 70 pages, it's a little shorter than that. And as you can see, it's been formatted that if you print this out, it's actually quite big. So it's actually not, when you think about normal print pages, it's not as many pages as it sounds like. But there's a lot of good information here. And as you can see, it's also interspersed with images. And this is an image actually of an Inuit storytelling map. And it says on the bottom, it charts every inlet along of an actual space, of the actual inlets along the edge of their place where they live in their territory of this particular tribe. But it's not necessarily for navigating, it's about navigating stories of like the past, the present, the future, right? And so the artist's time to know the land well enough to carve the map is part of what we're asking people to reflect on. So the maps and the inspiration points are a part of this journey as much as the content itself, right? And you can see that there will be moments along the way where you can learn more. It says follow for more here in one of the side text boxes. But there's also some places where actually sorry for scrolling so fast, but I'm looking for a place where the team actually invites pauses throughout the report. And if you haven't read the report yet, I invite you to just take those seriously as you go through, because their intention was to have people engage with the material and then take a moment and take that breath, right? Get back into your body and say, okay, if I had to sit with that for a minute, what would that mean? How, and not just kind of moving on to like, okay, so then what? Then what are you trying to say? What are you trying to get at, right? Which is sometimes how we tend to read. So this is what the report is, and it's got all these like beautiful moments and reminders and also invitations within it. It also has charts. If you like a chart, there are some charts in this for you, and there are stories as well. So I just wanted to give you some of that background so that you understand kind of the invitation to engage with that the team has been offering. But as I said before, the team was really looking at, and not just the team, but the wider presbytery. Like, why did we do this? Because the presbytery realized back in 2016, when it created the Anti-Racism Task Force, which is also members of our congregations, leaders, things like that, started realizing as it kind of reformulated over time that part of this work is understanding who we are and what we're doing so that we can figure out what we need to do to transform and change. So that's actually an invitation from the gospel, right? If you think about Romans 12, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. right? And the renewing of your mind may not just be what you think, right? But the renewing of the way you approach the world, the lenses you use, all those sorts of things. So, and then also retraining our focus away from only focusing on, is there someone who has an explicitly racist belief or some sort of church that's doing that, or attitudes that are racist, toward paying attention to structures of inequity. We don't really have congregations in our presbytery who are like, we're here to, who are saying, we're here and we are openly white supremacists, right? What we do have is a lot of well-meaning congregations who may not understand how they are embodying ways of being that are continuing to perpetuate harm, even when they're trying to live with love, right? And so I'm not saying that that's valley, but I'm just saying that's the clarity that this team came to, right? Because the danger is that the structures and the norms that we're a part of in our wider culture can become a part of our churches. They can become a part of our systems if we're not paying attention. So that's the paying attention is a huge part of this. So this fresh look that the report offered, one of the key things that came away from it, oh gosh, I didn't even put this in presentation notes, so y'all are just looking at my, that might be better. Thank you. Okay, so, but the basic background is we're not in alignment. That's one of the key things they found. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that everyone has to be in lockstep and agree about everything and we all have the same opinions. That's not what I'm talking about with alignment. What I'm saying is that we don't even have the same understandings of what certain ideas, words, concepts, and impacts look like. So for instance, when congregations were asked a question like, we primarily pick mission activities or volunteering activities based on the interests of our congregation and not on what is the highest interest or level of impact for our community. Most of our congregations, especially for people of color in our communities, right? There was that caveat on it. Most of our congregations and most folks said, we don't do that. We do not do that. But when you looked at how people of color responded to that question, many more people of color said, actually, we do that sometimes, right? So the lack of alignment is not about saying we have to agree on everything. Like I said, it's about saying that there's something that some folks are seeing in our midst about what our impact is or how our choices are being formed that other folks aren't seeing, which means maybe we're not in conversation, which means maybe we haven't kind of pulled that apart for everyone in a way that everyone sort of starts seeing what's there. So this isn't about suspicion, it's about curiosity, right? Like what are some people seeing that other folks are not seeing in the same way? So again, it's not just about our congregations, but obviously that was a question about congregational life, right? There were lots of questions about the presbytery and the presbytery's functioning as well. And so that was the key piece. So I have this question here, why does alignment matter? I said a couple things about that, but is there any other reason that you all think that having, again, alignment isn't agreement, right? Alignment is about we all are sort of having a clarity about what we're talking about and why. It's not that we all agree on everything. Why does that matter, do you all think?
Well, I think alignment goes with our mission statement. And, we say that, we believe in that, but do we act on it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So I think that's a great point. It's like if you have a common mission statement, then everyone, not agreeing, but everyone have some clarity around what are those values about and how could we talk about them together? And how could we discern if we're doing the thing or not? If we're doing what we say we want to do is really important. I read the other day, I got to remember where I read this particular quote, but it was saying that everyone being in agreement is dangerous, but everyone being in alignment is powerful. Because it's going back to that mission statement. We all agree that our values are pointed in this direction, right? So yeah, absolutely. Anything else y'all would add?
It's communication, because when we say something, it's important to be in alignment with what words mean, so that when we say something, people who hear what we're saying understand what we're saying. We might agree with what's being said, but if we don't understand what's being said, or agreeing with something that they didn't need.
Right, right. So it's not, right, so it's not about, saying I might still not disagree with you after you've made your statement, but at least I might understand the concepts that you're talking about, or I may have some clarity that, oh, yes, we talk about that all the time. So this is important, what you're saying, even if we might be coming from different directions. Absolutely. I also think the third thing about alignment that's really important is that it's a mark of courage in community, right? It means that a community has dug down to think about what is our mission? How are we going to communicate together? All these sorts of things in ways that allows for, courageous disagreement. And when I say courageous disagreement, I don't just mean being loud and wrong. I mean legitimately engaging, right? In a space that says, here's where I'm at with humility. And where are you, right? And how can we be, how can we have a transformative conversation together? So that takes courage. And so I think that alignment piece also is a mark that there's courage in the system. And that's really powerful. Okay, so with the discovery that there's a lack of alignment, and there's a chair up here if you want. I don't know if you want to be all the way up here, but but welcome. The team was naming that we need a culture shift. We need a radical transformation in the way we are together. And when you hear the word radical, that may sound very scary, but I mean it in the traditional sense of the word, which means roots, right? So a transformation that goes down to the root of who we are, how we want to be together, the reasons that you all show up in this space. Maybe you could name those. Maybe you'd have to think for a second and say, like, why, not that you don't have a reason. I know you have a reason for being here, but what would I say was my reason for staying connected to this work, to this space? It could be family. It could be connection. It could be your values that you want to live in the world. It could be your desire to be a part of the community in a healthy way, like the wider community, right? All of these things. It could be your genuine connection to your faith and how whether it's Jesus or the Holy Spirit is a part of your life and your daily breathing and being. Whatever those things are, getting back to those pieces and saying, how do we shift our way of being so that it not only changes how we are hopefully in fewer ways embodying harmful ways of being, but also increasing the healthy ways of being in our spaces. So when you read the report, if you or engage with it or listen to it or anything like that, you may be listening to the recommendations, and there's 5 overarching themes to the recommendations, and then a bunch of subpoints, which now the leaders in the system are seeing the subpoints to the subpoints and getting anxious. But what I keep trying to remind people is that it's going to look complicated when you see 6 pages of notes from the recommendations team, sort of saying, like, here's what we were thinking when we put this together. Like, you're obviously going to find your own way through, but here's what our intention was. And you might go 6 pages, 8 pages, whatever it is, right? And think that's complicated. But I want to invite us to think about the fact that actually what's complicated, we make things complicated in our human systems. We do that. And in fact, the more complicated the system is, the more likely it is to be embodying white supremacy culture, right? Bureaucracy, very, very, very good agents of white supremacy culture, right? But complex, that's what nature is. Nature is complex, it's interdependent, it's self-sustaining, it has different systems that sort of seem redundant, but actually aren't. They're supportive of one another, they're enlivening one another. So complexity is kind of what we're actually inviting people to look at. It's like, how is this shift inviting us to think about complexity and embody complexity in ways that we might not be used to? Because we might be used to doing something one way. Or maybe 2 ways, right? But what if it looked like trying 5 ways before we hit on a way that we're like, ooh, that's a good one, and those other 4 were really good too. But this 5th way, man, that's really doing something powerful. So trying to live into that complexity of trying things and figuring out, well, that was good, but let's try something else and see what we could do. So real change requires undoing those ingrained beliefs and patterns and the 1 or 2 ways that we know how to do things, both in our systems, our churches, our institutional life, and inside of ourselves. right? So you may know 1, 2, 3, 4 ways to show up in a conversation. I know I maybe know of a couple, right? Like of ways to show up. I need to learn more. And I think that probably is true for all of us in the room, that we need to learn a diversity of powerful ways to show up. And that might mean that one of those ways that I know how to show up just falls off the map, because I'm like, that isn't really helping me or anybody else, right? So that's why this work is best done in community, supporting and encouraging each other, because sometimes I'm only gonna learn what I need to let go of in my way of showing up by interacting and seeing like, oh, okay, yep, I'm seeing some feedback here that this is not working, okay? So, no, it's not gonna be easy. What the Presbytery Co-op is gonna be doing next. I can already see signs of people like looking at those 6 or 8 pages and going like, oh, I'm already tired, you know? But that's because we're not used to this, right? It's like, when I first got on my bike again, after many years of not riding a bike, I was just a mess. I like didn't know how to start. I didn't know how to stop. I looked like a real special person out there, you know? But it's because I wasn't used to the skills I needed, right? So we're gonna look a little bit like we don't know what we're doing sometimes. We're gonna feel like we don't know what we're doing because in fact, sometimes we don't exactly. We're still figuring it out. And that is actually a joyful, beautiful way to be. And I think about Valley as you all are moving into a time of transition. What does it look like to embrace the joyful beautifulness of not knowing exactly what you're doing, but in a way that invites this growth and powerfulness to who you're going to become and who you are becoming together, that has a lot of possibility and joy in it. So this has a lot of other outgrowths besides just its impact to anti-racism work, right? So I hope you're hearing that as well. So a couple shifts that you will hear as you are reading through the report are some shifts from being transactional in the way that we approach our relationships, the way that we approach our, I was even talking in another congregation and I was saying, you know, sometimes we're transactional in the way we approach what a church can offer. Right, like, well, this was one of our larger congregations, and I was saying, you know, sometimes it's about like, well, who's speaking on Sunday morning? You know what I mean? Well, they don't have enough doctors and enough letters after their name for me to make me show up, right? So this was one of those congregations where they love a couple titles after the name and things like that. And I was saying, you know, it's not that we can't be honest about what we're interested in, but it's also recognizing that maybe there's a transactional nature to that gets in the way of us really just being present for what's here. Instead of saying like, well, I'm not going to make time for that because it doesn't look interesting enough in the 2-minute blurb that I read about it, the 2-sentence blurb. So it could be something like that. It could be the way we engage in relationships, like I said. So transformational is a different way of being. Intellectualized to embody, we practiced that at the beginning, but there's a lot of ways to do that, right? So intellectualized to embodied and consumerist to collaborative. So that's a switch. You could look at it with the transactional piece in there too, but consumerist being like, well, what am I getting out of this, right? Kind of angle of things. And it's not to say that if we're in a space where we're not like the give and take of a particular relationship, like someone else is getting everything and we're getting nothing. That's not consumerism. That's just like, we're not having good reciprocity, right? We're not having good relationship reciprocity. But sometimes I can let the way I've been trained in consumerism to live into the way I approach church. Or the way I approach relationships, the way I approach my job, right? All those sorts of things, right? So what does it look like to lean into the word collaborative instead? Like, how is collaboration the engine that actually makes everything else move and not just like, well, what's in it for me, right? So these are strong contrasts that I'm drawing, and I don't want you to be like, well, I don't do that, so there's nothing in this for me. These are the strong contrasts so that we can kind of find ourselves in the spectrum. So I want to pause here for a second. What's bubbling up as you're hearing this so far? Because then we're going to move into some invitations. And I just want to hear where you're at in this. What impact do you think this has as you think about the topic of anti-racism as a Christian, as a human in the world, or for Valley in particular? Thoughts?
I think for cultural change, which is really what you're talking about, We need to involve and be open-minded to have people of other cultures, races, whatever, on those committees and listening to them. Because we can't assume, that they are, on the same wavelength as we are. So I think it's all of that culture, that communication that Myron talked about. We need to have that open mind and see what they're seeing about whatever committee you are on or what they need or whatever it might be.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that, that's an absolute yes. Like, we need to diversify, literally diversify some of our committees, our commissions. If we're talking about the presbytery level in our congregations, that might be, work that needs to be done as well. And also I'm aware that in a lot of our spaces, because of the history of Presbyterians and where we are right now as a denomination, we're 92% white. There aren't enough people of color to go around, right? And so this is not to disagree with what you're saying, because you're absolutely right. It's just to say an and of, we are still gonna have committees, commissions, and congregations that are primarily white, mostly white, like completely. We have some of our congregations that have no people of color whatsoever. They can still be doing anti-racism work that's powerful and transformative. I'm gonna reference this teacher in a moment, and when we go to the next slide, but I've really been transformed by this book called Sand Talk by Tyson Nuka-Porta. He's an Aboriginal Australian. And I was just listening to him last night, so I had to throw this slide in there. But one of the other things he was saying last night was, it is cool to learn about another culture or another way of being in the world and to learn from, right, those other cultures. But the most transformative thing you can do is learn about your own culture. Because you walking into a conversation or into a space, knowing the roots of who you are and how you've been formed is actually going to give more to the space. It's going to allow you to be more mindful of how you're showing up than anything else. And so I really think that was also a powerful message for any of us who are like from the United States, having been formed heavily by Western culture or any of these things. But he talked about it specifically being a man, because he was like, listen, I was trying to date girls in college, and I was trying to impress them. So I read Dante's Inferno. I don't know what kind of college he went to, so, but anyway, he was like, I was trying to, read Dante's Inferno. And so I was trying to impress them by learning it in like the original language and blah, 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 blah. And then I took all these like gender, like women's studies classes. So I was trying to be like, I know about this stuff, feminism and all that, And he was like, actually, and it's just like, it works sometimes, like whatever, but like, actually the most transformative thing I did was learn about male culture. Right? And learn about what it meant to have been shaped as a male person, a man in this world, and what culture that is. Like, what is that culture in my particular context, right? So he was thinking at it from a multi-ethnic angle and all sorts of other things. But all that to say, he was like, that was actually what was transformative for me, because then I knew how I was being and how that might be impacting other people. So that's just I hope that's a helpful answer to what you were saying, because you're absolutely right. And if we don't know how we're showing up, then we're not going to be as good at listeners in the conversation. Other things that y'all are thinking about. Impact for Valley or for yourself or anything like that. We're going to say no right now. Okay, there doesn't have to be anything else, but I just wanted to give another moment. Okay, so I wanted to move on to this part because this is not in the report in any form. This is just something I literally heard last night, and I was like, oh, this could be really good to talk about. Because what it's basically offering is some footholds or some stepping stones to how. Like, where do we take this? What does it look like to start being not as transactional, but more transformational, less intellectual, more embodied, less consumerist, but more collaborative? Like, that's a journey, right? It's a journey, and that's why the report is framed as a journey model. So part of that is you're gonna get lost sometimes, and you're gonna be confused, and you're gonna go like, okay, I understand the concept, and I think I understand what we're trying to get to, but like, how do I start, right? That lostness is powerful when we acknowledge it. But when we're just trying to grab for like, okay, what can I grab onto to do something or feel good about it? Actually, you lose the energy of that moment of just being like, I actually don't know what to do next. Right? Or I actually don't know how to be more embodied right now, right? Because I've struggled with that my whole life, or I've always thought of myself in this other kind of way, or whatever. Acknowledging the lostness that we might feel as a co-op of congregations, as individual congregations, whatever it is, that is powerful, sacred work. How many stories in the Bible are about being lost? Right? Or being in the wilderness, right? Jesus began his ministry where? By first being lost in the wilderness for 40 days. I mean, I don't know if he was literally lost, but he was out there for 40 days, right? So he was wandering. So that's where powerful things begin, when we can acknowledge it. And in fact, I mean, there's a lot, we could go into a whole thing there, so I don't want to do that. I don't want to get deep into the Bible right now. Like, we could do a whole sermon series about that, right? But all that to say, Tyson Yunkaporta also talked last night, and I thought that I would throw this in here, about protocols for living systems. And if we go back to what I was saying before about complex versus complicated, the complexity acknowledges that we here, you at Valley, are a living system. You're not a series of only written mission statements, or only, session minutes, or what you have printed in your bulletin, or the schedule for a Sunday morning. That's not who you are. Who you are is in this room, it's out in the hall, right? It's the singing that's coming. It's a complex system. It's a living system. So these are his, this is coming from Aboriginal wisdom and his own sort of extrapolation of that. He's like, these are the protocols. One, diversify. And what he means by that is he does not mean just go look for diversity somewhere else. He means maintain your own differences. And each of us in this room, we each have our own unique differences and diversity that we bring to a space that we don't always talk about or think about, because we just sort of think like, oh yeah, but I'm kind of like everybody else, you know what I mean? But you have a story, you have a context you come from, you have a family system you come from, right? You have knowledge that you bring. So maintain your own differences, even with those who are similar to you. And I think that's rich in a church space, right? Because we tend to kind of cluster within a church space, or even in friend groups in church spaces. So what does it look like to maintain the diversity, even within our kind of little smaller groups that we make of ourselves? And then connect, form pairs, form kinship groups and things like that, and make that about expanding your networks of connection. So in other words, you could think about the families, the units, the individuals that show up at Valley. Those are the individual pieces that come together to begin connecting here, and then going out and connecting in community. And I think about the work that Valley is doing with the Indigenous community locally and kind of in partnership. And a lot of that has been fueled by one of your former youth who is now an adult, right? And her knowledge and connections. Right? And so that bringing all those connections, and then the connections she's making as a result of the connections you all are making, right? So it's all of that richness. So that connection is huge as a piece. And then he says interact, which is the interaction is the energy that powers the whole system. So, how does not just Valley, but how do the individuals within Valley share and interact in ways that continue to build that? So share in the system via living knowledge, via resources. And resources, he was literally like, you cannot hoard your resources. You cannot hoard your knowledge, right? And so what knowledge are we hoarding? I don't know. I would have to sit and think about that. What resources are we hoarding? That's maybe easier because we have spreadsheets to talk about that. But not all of our resources are money, right? Not all of our resources are money. So what other resources do we have? Maybe you have a really vibrant XYZ program, right? And that's a resource that you all have. And I'm not saying that you can't enjoy that, but is there a way that it can be shared and magnified? Interacting with those who are dissimilar to you and outside your system. You have to keep your system open. So what does it look like to think about? Is our system open or not? And then this last and most important one, I think is particularly important today for Valley, but really for all of us in all of our work in the world, adapt. He says it's the most important protocol of an agent, meaning an individual, in a sustainable system. You must be prepared to change so that the energy in the system isn't blocked. And we think of our churches as places that can kind of change sometimes, but actually churches are extremely good at maintaining our structures, our ways of doing things, our ways of thinking about things, our ways of talking about things, right? So what does it look like to become an adaptation laboratory? Within yourself, within the congregation. I mean, if that scares the crap out of you, I'm sorry. Like, you know, like sit with that in your body for a minute, you know? Like, what does it mean to really live into that idea that like, I am always adapting. My body is always adapting, right? My body is always changing. How does that adaptation become the way that I am the most human I can be, right? The most authentically human I can be. And then the final thing he said, somebody who's really doing this, any person who's really doing this, any system who's really doing this is more prepared to handle giant seismic shifts in the system. And we've just had a giant seismic shift, right, in COVID. But I know that you all are going to go through another shift in saying goodbye to Richard and blessing him on his journey and knowing that you will continue in beautiful and powerful ways as you move forward, right? And trusting that and living, you know, working with the grief of that, the possibility of that, all the things, that's the adaptation work, right? So I just wanted to throw these out here for thinking, for reflection. Anything you all want to add about that or reflect on related to those things? Okay, you don't get to be silent the whole time because we're going to try and talk in a second. So no worries, you don't have to have a big thought on that one. But this is just a really simple reminder that this is something, I don't want to say I made it up because pretty much anything that I've ever come up with is informed by everything I've learned before that, right? But this is a little framework for thinking about like how we be together, how we are together, how we live together informs how we use the knowledge that we have together, which informs what we do together, right? So oftentimes we think of know being first, like if I know something, then I can do something and then I'm going to be different. What if we started with be? And like, what would it look like to just try being different or even just paying attention to how I'm being right now so that I can learn in a different kind of way. And then I can do in a different kind of way. And then that will shape my being going forward, which means that it will, right? And so it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before related to we want to have more diversity in our spaces. And sometimes we will, and sometimes we won't. But the more I learn about who I am being or how I have been shaped, the more powerful I will be able to be in terms of how I, you know, how I hold new learning from people around me, who are diverse, who are like me, whatever. And then how I do.
Anna,
Yeah,
a light bulb just went on.
okay, yeah, go ahead.
I think that awareness or being is also related to age. Because of how do we, I as an older person, listen to a younger person's voice.
Yeah,
And I remember when, coloring your hair, you know, people, young folk, and it's like, the rest of us are going, what? But now I do it.
all right.
Or
Okay.
funky hairstyles.
Yeah,
You know,
sure.
so it's learning, allowing ourselves to learn from, it's a totally different perspective.
Totally, absolutely. And I think I was actually I was at a Women of Color gathering this weekend. And we had some really cool conversations about like actually generational and intergenerational relationships. So like there were older Gen X folks in the room and there were young Gen Z folks in the room and everyone in between, like as a sometimes called geriatric millennial, which nobody appreciates that word. Like, there's nothing wrong with being an age, but come on. So but as an elder millennial, like, we were all just like joking about, right, the various things that we need to be learning from one another, and that there is learning that happens both ways, but it can't happen if we're being rigid in our like, well, how I am is the way. Or likewise, I don't have anything to offer from my way of being, right? So all that to say, yeah, I think that's a really great point. That's a really great point. So this is the question for you to turn and talk. What is your stake in all of this? It could be something specific that we talked about this morning. It could be going all the way back to the thinking about the report and sort of the recommendations that we become a more complex system, right? That we not think about making things more complicated, but making things more complex. It could be some of the more recent things that we talked about. But what is your stake in this for yourself, for Valley, for anything else that you're bringing into this conversation? So turn to one or two people next to you, and what is your stake in all of this? Okay.
So, thanks.
You have a.
Right now.
Oh, all right. Well, can you read me? What is your stake?
Just trying to listen and learn.
Yeah, and I'm inviting you to think about where are you? All right. What do you all think?
What do I think?
What's your stake? Like why?
Well, I live in this country.
You what?
I live in this country. On the church. Affected by everything. I just wanted to try to listen and learn.
So showing us to listen, but also, you know, your parts of the. Yeah.
Well, you tell me.
Did you get to talk about your city at all?
Sure.
You too bad it's not in the front row.
Yeah.
I know, it's such a team inside. What do you think, like, what made you show up? What made you show up today, or what are you thinking about in terms of how this affects you? Oh, so you've been peer pressure. I appreciate that, good job. To be present. So you're doing it for the benefit of others, and that's who you are too.
Experience.
Nice. And I invite you, I hope you get to say what you thought too. So, yeah. There you go. That's Say what else? Oh, man, that's not true. What do you think? Why does any of this make a difference to you? The world, to the school, to life?
Our kids have been, I guess, making sure you're contributing to other support about it. Great thinking, relationships, and you do some day.
Right on, right on. Yeah, so like even just trying to figure out That's okay. Yeah. Yeah, please show up. So, yeah, I think you have the answer. Thank you. And sometimes we do it for other people, and sometimes we do it for ourselves, you know, and bring our kids, or whatever. It counts as a reason. Okay, let's come back together.
You're good.
I know not everyone may have gotten to share. There are some people who are deeply regretting having sat in the front row today. Let that be a lesson to you. No. No, it's not true. But all that to say, like, yeah, thank you for talking a little bit together. Maybe not everyone got a chance to speak, because it was a brief moment, but anything that came from your conversation that you want to share? Yeah.
I'll just say that everything you've been talking about is so applicable to what Mally's facing.
Mm-hmm.
And the focus you're saying about getting to know who you are, we need to know who we are.
Yeah.
And that's part of the first step, you know, that we're gonna be taken through is coming up with who we are and report and all that kind of fun Presbyterian stuff we like to do. But it's important, that's my point.
Yeah, absolutely. Doing some of that, like, I don't know, like inward searching. I think some folks very naturally are drawn to that. I'm a person who's naturally drawn to that because I don't know if any of you study the Enneagram. But either way, like I'm the type of person who likes a good inward journey. Right? Some of us are not used to that at all, or do not like it, or do not like having to think about deep personal questions, right? Welcome, right? Like that is actually really powerful work. And like you said, it's good for groups as well as for individuals. So yeah, absolutely. Anything else that people want to add?
We talked about, how we were raised. I was raised in a very conservative family, small family. And so as an adult, I'm thinking, well, I should be that way now, right? I should be that way because my parents were, you know, the greatest. I was very blessed with that. And so they taught me a lot of things and, okay, so I should be with that. I should be like that now, but the world has changed.
Yeah.
Right? And I need to change with that and look at things in a different way. Maybe not a bad way, but a different way.
Yes.
And the world was different then. So,
Yes, the world was very different, and the world was very different 10 years ago, right? So, so it's not that there's no wisdom to be drawn from the past. There is, but we just have to be careful what we're holding on to. I see a hand back here.
Well, speaking to Jan, it is very frustrating, I think, to collaborate with someone who is rigidly, this is the way I was raised, and I am not going to budge. Because that was right, and they only, which makes it very difficult to grow and change.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting because if you look at the history of Christianity, for instance, the first 300 years that Christianity existed, it had very few structures, very few. It was when it became the official religion of Rome. Suddenly they were like, okay, we have to agree on a couple of things, right? We're going to have structures, we're going to have agreement, we're going to have some creeds, we're going to have some, like, all these sorts of things. And actually, it kind of quashed the capacity for Christianity to adapt. And so ever since then, I think we've been struggling between those two things, right? All the institutional structures that aren't necessarily bad, but they don't help us adapt. And so absolutely, sometimes you have to think about, like, what was not just our religion, but who are we built for? What are we built for as humans? And we are built, our genius as a species is adaptation, right? So I think you're right. It can be hard to collaborate in a space like that. And one of my practices has been continuing to figure out, like, who can I collaborate with? Sometimes there are people who I'm like, whoa, I don't know. It doesn't seem like this is a good collaborative partnership. And so it doesn't mean I'm not going to talk to you again. but maybe this isn't the right relationship to keep blossoming and building to what we need to do. So yeah, absolutely. I saw another hand in here somewhere.
Oh, I'm just kind of saying, see if I can remember what I was, but Jan was saying that, all the world has changed from her parents, I'm thinking, and yet it hasn't changed very much. It hasn't changed really that much either. I mean, yes, we're more technology and there's, but still, I don't think the humans have changed them. That's in the past 200-300 years, we still collect, we still gravitate towards ourselves, or who we are, similar with them, and the others are others,
Yeah.
and so I mean, I didn't change enough.
More change. No, absolutely. Actually, there's this great book, by Rutger Bregman called Humankind. And one of the things he talks about is this like instinct in humanity to kind of stick with who we already know and who we already like and kind of the in-group mentality, right? And he talks about how actually sometimes we overestimate the importance of that in our human society because of how we've organized ourselves now. But if you look back to the indigenous past of all across the world, actually there was maybe more openness in our ancient history in some ways than there is now. So isn't that kind of mess with your mind a little bit, right? So anyway, all that to say, I would highly recommend that book. I'm really enjoying it so far. He does a really great thing where he tells you a really sad story and then he's like, but, so let me tell you something else, right? So he's constantly messing with me, but I really like that book because it kind of explodes that idea that yes, we absolutely are dealing with exactly what you're saying. And we actually might have more wisdom in our ancient history and our root programming, shall we say, our core way of being than we think we do. So I want to leave you with this takeaway, finding our way to the world and communities that we long for. And that's kind of what I was also trying to get at with the stakes. Like, what are you hungry for your own life, for your faith life, for your church, for your family, for your community, whatever it is? Most of the time, those words end up being very similar. Right? We want to have peace and not war, right? But like genuine peace, not just kind of like repression that doesn't allow for dissent, right? We want to have a sense of ease in our communities. We want to have a sense of energy. We want to have, right? Like a lot of things are similar, right? So whatever we want will require us to release practices that no longer serve us and learn new ones. So that goes back to the adaptation piece, right? It goes back to the transformational piece. It goes back to the collaboration piece we were talking about, right? So this is just a reminder. It's an invitation going all the way back to the, we are talking about the report right now, even though I haven't mentioned it in the last 5 minutes, because the report invites us on exactly this journey. And the report is trying to say, if you aren't sitting here going like, my core issue is anti-racism and that's why I'm sitting here this morning, that's okay. What are you passionate about? What do you care about? I promise you that it is related to and depends upon the same practices, right? Gender issues, race, peace in the best sense of the word, all those sorts of things, all of those issues, the ecosystem and ecological justice, all of these things depend on the same practices. So with that invitation, reminder, all those sorts of things, I look forward to seeing where Valley takes this. I challenge each of you in this room to read the report or listen to it by the end of 2023. You have many weeks before now and then. There's a couple holidays there, but it's fine. But all that to say, I challenge you to do that. I challenge you to invite one other person who's not in this room to read the report with you and talk about it. Because the more people in this congregation that read the report, engage it together, have conversations, the more people will be able to have that common language that we were talking about earlier on and start thinking about, okay, so what does this mean to us? Where does this bring us? In 2024, there's going to be a lot of new cool things happening in the presbytery level. We're going to start talking about new, when I say educational opportunities, they may be straightforward. They may be more like retreat spaces. We're even starting to talk about travel opportunities related to anti-racism, transformational practices, and all those sorts of things. So stay tuned for some of that. But thank you all for inviting me this morning.